Madam President, I rise for the customary farewell address. And I'd like to begin by thanking our colleague and our leader, Mitch McConnell, for his very, very kind words. I appreciate that, Leader McConnell. And I would also like to say I appreciate the confidence that you have repeatedly placed in me. Your recollections brought back many memories. One was the super committee. And I served on the super committee, but what most of you probably don't know is that Leader McConnell had great reservations about putting me on the super committee. Oh yeah. And he grilled me for what seems like it was hours over several occasions. But here's why. He grilled me because he wanted an outcome. And his concern was, will this firebrand from the Club for Growth be willing to compromise, be willing to reach an agreement that couldn't possibly be exactly what he wanted? And what was most important, as I recall from our conversations, to Leader McConnell was that the people on that super committee, at least the ones that he could appoint, be interested in a successful outcome. And Madam President, I would suggest that one of the things that is underappreciated about Leader McConnell is how relentlessly focused he is on outcomes. It's hard to know because he doesn't tell us that much about what he's thinking, if you haven't noticed. But I'm pretty sure that that is a big driver. So, Leader McConnell, I appreciate your leadership. I appreciate the confidence you've placed in me. I appreciate our friendship and terrific working relationship. For the many thanks that I have to give, I'll start with my family, starting with my parents. They did a great job raising 6 kids, I'll tell you that much. I have to really stress my gratitude for my wife. Chris, most of you probably don't know, but Chris had a very successful and promising career as a consultant, which she put aside so that I could pursue mine. So, in many ways, I think she had a tougher job, because she was home raising 3 kids, and she has done a phenomenal job of that. So last month, we celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary, and I think I'll spend the next 25 years letting her know how much I appreciate her. So our kids are here. Our kids are, Bridget is 22, Patrick is 21, and Duncan is 12 and a half. And you know, growing up in a political family has its disadvantages. You would be surprised to learn, but it seems like about every 6 years or so, people ran some really nasty ads about me on television. They did. The kids see ads, obviously. Also, I missed more of their activities than I would have liked to because I had to be here. But they were always terrifically understanding about that. And I'm sure looking forward to spending more time with each of them. Now, for those of us who serve in this body, we all know that staffs are the unsung heroes of our successes. And I've been luckier than anybody deserves to be with the teams that I have had working for me over the years. 18 years in public office over a 24-year period, 6 in the House, 12 in the Senate. And I've just had wonderful, wonderful folks, mostly younger people, as we know our staffs tend to be, but just terrifically capable, hardworking, bright people. My state staff, for instance, Leader McConnell was kind enough to point out the reputation that we had. I don't deserve the credit for that. They're the ones that worked so hard on behalf of our constituents, from Philly to Erie and the other 65 counties and innumerable little boroughs and townships. Every day they approached constituent service with enthusiasm and professionalism that was amazing. I mean, little boroughs requesting federal grants, and businesses struggling with federal bureaucracies and regulations, veterans stymied by the VA or Social Security Administration. It didn't matter what it was. My staff was on the ball, getting the job done and doing it with a great attitude. My personal office here in D.C., both when I was in the House and in the Senate, also just terrific, terrific people. You know, I represent a very big state that's relatively close to Pennsylvania, so we have a huge number of constituents who want to come down and make their case, as they should. Most of those meetings end up getting taken by our staff, as you know, and they've just done such a great job. Our ledge and comms shops always working so hard to get the policy exactly right and get our message right. Administrative staff that kept things running smoothly, so I never had to worry about it. And I have to say a special thanks to the Banking Committee staff. These guys, so I've been on the Banking Committee since I got here, but only the last 2 years have I been the ranking member on the committee. And I honestly think we accomplished about as much as you can when you're in the minority, and so much is because of just a great team. We focused on all the areas of jurisdiction of the committee: financial services, monetary policy, housing, transit. We did a lot of important work on the nominees to important regulatory posts. I think we did a good job of providing the oversight of powerful regulators, including encouraging them to stay in their lanes. And I'll always be grateful to them. By the way, many of them are still here, and they'll be here to the bitter end. We're still processing requests for the Omni. I got to say a big thanks to the campaign teams that I have had over the years. You know, my first House primary was a very improbable success. I know most of you are thinking any election that I won was an improbable success. I get that. But I can tell you for sure it wouldn't have happened without a terrifically talented, dedicated campaign staff, some of whom became part of the official staff, others who've chosen to stay on the political side. As for all you guys, my colleagues, you know, I've teamed up with every Republican at some point over the years, and most of my Democratic colleagues also at one time or another. And it's been a real honor and it's been a privilege to work with each of you. You folks have been terrific allies, even when it's on an item that's a rare item of agreement. Speaking of which, let me say a word about my colleague, Bob Casey. You know, I don't think you could ask for a more collegial, thoughtful colleague than the fellow that shares the senatorial responsibilities with me for Pennsylvania. Fact is, we cancel each other's vote out almost every time. That is a true fact. But we've also worked together when we could. And one of the areas where we had just tremendous success is filling vacancies on the federal bench in Pennsylvania. In fact, Senator Casey, according to the last count that I have, you and I working together these last 12 years got 33 federal judges confirmed to the bench in Pennsylvania. Now that happens because we have great staff work happening. We have volunteers who do a wonderful job of vetting candidates across our Commonwealth. But it also happens because Bob and I wanted to get this job done so that the people of Pennsylvania could have justice. And I think that only New York and California have had more judges confirmed in this time. So, Senator Casey, I appreciate the great working relationship we have had. As a general matter, as a body, I think we all understand we're not that popular. But I don't think I've ever worked with a more impressive group of individuals, and so I appreciate having had that chance. I also have to thank the people of this great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that my family and I get to live in. Represent Leader McConnell used my line, it's true, and I say it all the time, and it'll always be true. Representing Pennsylvania in the United States Senate for these 12 years has been the greatest honor of my professional life. And I'll always be enormously grateful to the wonderful people of this great state for their entrusting me this awesome responsibility. And I also am equally grateful to the people who made those the volunteers who made those campaigns successful. When I think about my mission in the Senate, I think about two complementary aspects of it. First, it's to represent and defend the specific interests of Pennsylvania. And I've tried to do that to the best of my ability. I think sometimes we're such a big and diverse state that what's good for Pennsylvania is usually good for America, and vice versa. But it's also been important to me to defend and advance the cause of personal freedom. In the hierarchy of political values, freedom is first for me. I think the real purpose of government is to secure the blessings of liberty, and government too often is the source of restrictions on our freedom instead. But in this category of defending and advancing personal freedom, my focus has tended to be the economic realm. Economic freedom is a fundamental aspect of personal freedom, and there is a well-documented high correlation between a society's economic freedom and the level of prosperity and the standard of living of the people in that society. So you probably won't be surprised to learn that I think my biggest legislative accomplishment was that opportunity that I had to be part of a small group of senators, finance committee members, who got a chance to develop and help pass the 2017 tax reform. That group included Senator Portman, Senator Scott, Senator Thune, and countless hours that we spent in a conference room dealing with what was a very complex product. We took our draft and we presented it to our colleagues, and over a course of many weeks, we kind of iterated our way to what became the most sweeping tax reform in at least 30 years. And we expanded economic freedom with that product. And honestly, I have to tell you, I think the results were even better than what we had hoped for. By the time the tax reform had been fully implemented, take calendar year 2019, we had the strongest economy of my lifetime. We had strong economic growth, 50-year low unemployment, all-time record low unemployment for African Americans, all-time record low unemployment for Hispanic Americans and other ethnic minority groups. Wages were growing, and they were growing faster than the rate of inflation, which means that workers were able to see a rising standard of living. And wages were growing fastest for the lowest income Americans, so we were also narrowing the income gap. We ended corporate inversions. There hasn't been one since. Remember how frequently they were occurring. And with a lower corporate tax rate, but also fewer deductions, business boomed. The corporate tax rate is down to 21%. This year, with a 21% top rate, we're exceeding the revenue projections that were made prior to tax reform when the rate was 35%. And this is not just about inflation. As a share of our economy, total federal tax revenue is at a multi-decade high. So much for the thought that we were going to increase the size of the deficit from the tax reform. Oh, and by the way, we also made the tax code even more progressive than it was. That's right. Higher earners now pay a greater portion of the total tax burden than they did before our tax reform. Now, I know my Democratic colleagues were skeptical about this, and I understand that. But I would like to suggest the data is in, and it's really good. There are important provisions that are scheduled to expire, and I do hope that Congress and the administration can find a bipartisan path to extending, or better still, making permanent these otherwise expiring provisions. And I hope you'll indulge me for just a few moments to make a couple of other recommendations. I've got one for my Republican colleagues. I've got one for my Democratic colleagues, mostly for my Democratic colleagues, and two for this institution that we have had this privilege to serve in. For my Republican colleagues, let me just say, our party can't be about or beholden to any one man. We're much bigger than that. Our party is much bigger than that. We are the political representation of this huge center-right coalition across America. On a good day, that's more than half of Americans. And I hope we resist the temptation to adopt the protectionist, nativist, isolationist, redistributive policies that some are suggesting we embrace. I think those are inconsistent with the core values of a majority of the people in this coalition. More important, I think those ideas lead to bad outcomes for our country. For my Democratic colleagues, I've heard many of you passionately, and I believe sincerely, declare your determination to defend our democracy. But I'd suggest we all remember that democracy requires much more than the ease of voting in an election. Elections are absolutely unnecessary, but they're an insufficient condition for a truly democratic society. Elections really are a means to an end. They are not the end themselves. The end or purpose of elections is to provide the mechanism of accountability of the government to the people whose consent is our sole source of legitimacy. When we hand over Congress's responsibilities to unelected and therefore unaccountable parts of our government, be that the courts or independent regulators or executive branch agencies, we really undermine our democracy, which of course is really our republic, because we weaken the accountability of our government. Now, look, both sides have done this over time, but I just hope we could all agree that preserving more responsibility and therefore accountability for the legislative branch of government is a good thing for our republic. And then 2 suggestions for this amazing historic institution. First one, and it's the most important one, please keep the filibuster. It's the only mechanism that forces bipartisan consensus. It prevents governance from the extremes. By forcing bipartisanship, it results in more durable legislation, and so lessens the likelihood of big swings in policies, and it provides stability for our constituents. And if you want to see more polarization, get rid of the filibuster and we will have much more polarization. The second thought I had that I wanted to share with you is I think we can all agree that the Senate has not been functioning as well as it once did and as it really should. I don't think too many committees are producing too much legislation the old-fashioned way, and the old-fashioned way is actually a pretty good vetting process for developing legislative ideas. And when legislation does get to the floor, typically there are very few substantive amendments that are allowed to be considered. The result is, as a body, it's very difficult for us to discover whether and where there might be a consensus. There's a lot of reasons for this, including political polarization, that reasons why the Senate behaves in a way that tends to block debate and voting. But there might be some relatively modest tweaks in Senate rules that might just facilitate restoring some of what used to be normal functioning. And I know a lot of you have done a lot of work in this, and that work is still underway. Let me suggest you consider one small tweak, a small but important technical change to a rule, the rule which enables the obstruction of the body. I'm not talking about the filibuster, but rather the rule that effectively requires unanimous consent in most cases to allow a vote on an amendment, any amendment, even a germane amendment. I can tell you most Pennsylvanians are very surprised to learn that in order for a senator to get a vote on almost anything, he or she needs the permission of every other senator. I don't think this rule is workable any longer, and it contributes to the dysfunction. So I've just got a simple idea. Consider raising the threshold for blocking an amendment to some number greater than 1. Now, I support the filibuster because I think it is reasonable for 41 senators to be able to block legislation. It just doesn't seem reasonable for 1. So I don't know what the right number is, and I'm not religious about this. Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 20, maybe it's 50. But I would just suggest that this body consider somehow raising the bar of preventing the Senate from functioning. There may be better ways to do it, but that's one suggestion. Let me conclude with this. You know, we have all inherited something really, really, truly special, and I know we all appreciate that. The fact that we live in the greatest country in the history of humanity, and we serve in this amazing legislative body. I suspect we all get asked, I know I get asked from time to time some version of the question, how worried are you about our country's future? And often there's some combination of national security, political polarization, and the future of our economy that's the primary concern of the people posing the question. My short reply is usually, look, we've gotten through much tougher times. But think about it. I think that's so true, and it's important to remember. On national security, I mean, there are real threats out there. Russia is obviously led by a vile and dangerous bully. The Chinese Communist Party is a rising and increasingly aggressive threat, but nowhere do we face the imminent threats that we faced during World War II and at several moments during the Cold War. And we are polarized, and it's uncomfortable, and it's problematic. But in 1968, we had political assassinations and cities were being burned down. And this chamber, this very chamber we're in right now, first opened its doors in 1859. Imagine living through the decade that followed that. As for the economy, look, there's always risks to any economy. Ours is no exception. I think inflation is a significant problem. There's a possibility we have a recession next year. We have huge and growing national debt, and I think that is going to be a real challenge for us. But I think it's worth remembering this. The vast majority of Americans have a much higher standard of living today than our parents did when they were our age. And a rising standard of living is, after all, the purpose of economic growth. So I always answer that question about America's future with the truth, and that is that despite our challenges, I'm extremely bullish on America. And I think my optimism is easily justified by our history. America's always been able to survive and thrive, and America remains the greatest nation in the history of the world. If we keep on being Americans, we'll remain the greatest nation on the planet. Thank you, Madam President.